Hi, welcome to Week 1, Lecture 3, Part 1 of 2. We're going to cover Section 1.5, Inductive Arguments. So if you remember, in the last section, in the last lesson, what we covered were deductive arguments. And if you recall, an argument is deductive if and only if. You'll notice that sometimes I'll write the if with two F's, and that's just an abbreviation for if and only if. So if you ever see that come up, just think if and only if. But for the most part, I will try to make sure to keep these apart. So what we had last time was that an argument is, actually, we should say deductively valid. An argument is deductively valid. Go. If and only if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So if and only if it is not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And now remember, the important distinction here we made was not whether or not the premises are in fact true as a fact of the world, but if we can imagine them to be true. So in all the scenarios in which we imagine them to be true, does the conclusion have to be true in those scenarios as well? Today, we're going to talk about inductive arguments. And inductive arguments are not deductive ones. So if you have an inductive argument, that means that you do not have a deductive argument. If you have an inductive argument, then it is not deductive. So before I say a little bit more about what inductive an argument is and give you the definition, the idea here is that not all arguments, not all good arguments are deductive arguments. Right? So not all deductive, or sorry, let's put it this way, not all good arguments are deductive arguments. And in fact, you'll be quite familiar with these if you do any kind of science. So, for example, if you notice that let's actually use the example from the text. So we have if John, Bob, Sally, and Joanne are left-handed. So let's suppose that John, Bob, Sally, and Joanne are left-handed. So this is going to be an example of a good argument that is not necessarily deductive. So we have John, Bob, and Sally are left-handed. John, Bob, Sally, John, Bob, and Sally struggle with right-handed can openers. Therefore, Joanne struggles with right-handed can openers. So here, notice that we can still actually break this argument into standard form, which, although I've presented it here in pretty close to natural English, this is not hard to present in standard form. So we make the first premise, John, Bob, Sally, and Joanne are left-handed. We make the second premise, John, Bob, and Sally struggle with right-handed can openers. And we have as our conclusion that therefore Joanne struggles with right-handed can openers. So notice that this is not deductive, right? Because we can imagine a scenario in which both the premises are true, and yet Joanne, for some reason or another, because maybe she had a lot of practice, is actually able to use right-handed can openers. So it's not deductive because there's a possible counterexample. Nevertheless, the argument is good, or we can think that this could be a good argument. And the reason why is because, I mean, this is everyday reasoning that we use, right? When you see a bunch of occurrences, then that gives you reason to think that that you'll see the same thing again in the future. Now that's not deductive, but there's a high probability or certain likelihood that you can assign to it. So this likelihood that we can assign to the conclusion is called inductive strength. So inductive arguments can have different degrees of inductive strength. And let's just give the definition of inductive strength here. And we'll follow the text closely on this one. So we say that an argument has inductive strength to the extent that the conclusion is probable given the premises. So if it makes the conclusion more likely to be true than not to be true, then that argument has a high degree of inductive strength. So let's emphasize this again. Not all good arguments are deductive arguments. Inductive arguments with high deductive strength can be good arguments as well. However, in this course we're not going to be looking at inductive arguments. We're going to be focusing more on deductive arguments, which is a whole class of arguments that are interesting in their own right, and inductive arguments are interesting in their own right as well, but there's just not time to do both of them. So in this course we're going to focus primarily on deductive arguments, but what we just wanted to point out was that there are also other kinds of good arguments, and these, for example, these are going to be inductive arguments that have high degrees of inductive strength. But we're going to focus mainly on deductive arguments for the purposes of this course. Okay, so if you have any questions about this section, please either make some comments below or make sure to bring them to class.